Thank you all for joining today. It's wonderful to be able to be together and to talk about agency public access policies focused on data sharing, specifically agencies that currently have policies in effect. And so just to kind of kick things off, I thought it might be helpful to give a very, very high level overview of what the expectations are around data sharing and data management that were included in the 2022 OSTP public access memo. So, this memo, of course, is directing agencies on kind of what the expectations are in terms of the research that they fund. And so in the memo, it talks about agencies needing to develop new plans and policies, and in particular, policies around publications and data management sharing are expected to go into effect by the end of this calendar year, December 31st. And so this guidance talks about, including data management and sharing requirements in kind of new policies to really maximize data sharing, and also to include additional guidance focused on data repositories and data preservation. And this is all kind of building on work and policies that agencies already had in response to the 2013 OSTP public access memo. So it's really building on those expectations. And then, these kind of agency expectations then, turn into policies that are focused on, grantee or extramural funded research. And so these expectations include making data underlying peer-reviewed publications freely available at the time of the publication, that the data repositories that you're using should be in alignment with the NSTC, National Science and Technology Council's desirable characteristics document that they put out. And that data management and sharing plans, or data management plans as they were previously called and are still called in some agency policies, they should really be developed to describe how data will be managed and shared through the course of the research. Provide plans and timelines for sharing other data and maximizing that data sharing. And then if there is data that will be created or used but can't be shared, an explanation for why that is. And so there are a number of agencies that already have their policies in effect. And I will say NASA's Science Mission Directorate policy and NIH's policy were already in development prior to the 2022 memo being released. But it happens that as they were developing the policies, they are in alignment with the expectations of the memo. And so those came out very quickly. So NASA Science Mission Directorate's policy came out in December of 2022 and is effective, became effective for new solicitations and agreements after that date. And this is not the NASA-wide policy, but I will say that NASA Science Mission Directorate does fund 70% of NASA's extramural research funding. And so those folks at external institutions that have NASA funding are very likely to fall under the policies under the Science Mission Directorate. NIH's policy came out well in advance before the implementation date, but the effective date is January of 2023. And then there's a wave of kind of newer agency policies that were developed after the 2022 memo came out to specifically address those requirements. So Department of Education's policy went into effect September 30th of last year. CDC effective October 1st, AHRQ in December, EPA in January of this year, and then actually breaking news, FDA's policy was actually just updated and released last week. So FDA had issued a public access policy in December of last year with a start date of January 1st of 2026. But with the new administration and new priorities, and I think also because, for example, NIH moved up their implementation date, FDA decided to update that policy. It is very similar to what they had put out before, but there are references to gold standard science, and FDA actually has also already put out their gold standard science response. And so there's kind of, cross language between the two. And so they put out their updated policy, and it went into immediate effect on August 15th. I've been in conversations with FDA to try to make sure that I'm interpreting the policy correctly, but I believe it's for new awards starting that will be issued after August 15th. So what I thought we could do today is kind of focus on a few different areas of the policies and kind of look at how the agencies compare in these different areas. And this is similar to what we did in the last webinar focused on publications. And first, starting with the policy scope. So pretty much across all agencies, um, this is applicable widely. It's applicable to grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, and also intramural research. I will say Department of Education's policy does talk specifically about grants and this being applicable to the extramural research that they do fund through grants. All of the policies do provide a definition around scientific data. Um, there is there are some slight differences in the exact language that agencies use, but there are similarities. So across all agencies, the data that they're talking about that fall under the policy are digital recorded factual materials used to validate research. And I think that's really key. As we'll get into, thinking about what data needs to be shared, I think it's important to kind of remember that definition. And really these policies are focused on data needed to validate that research. There's also a lot of kind of things that are excluded from this definition of data. Some are the same across all of these agencies. So for example, preliminary analysis, samples, specimens, physical objects, draft papers, future research plans, and communications with colleagues are not considered data and are kind of I should say, they're not considered data in the context of this policy, and so those are excluded. Lab notebooks is another thing that's commonly excluded, as well as peer reviews. And then NIH and Department of Education also talk about case reports being excluded. In terms of the expectations around the data sharing, across agencies, there is this expectation coming from the memo about data underlying peer-reviewed publications, and that does need to be shared. And so most agencies say that that data needs to be available and shared as much as can be shared at that article publication date. So it should be made publicly available that same time that the publication that it's underlying is made available. There are two exceptions to that. The first is FDA, and FDA's language says that data, and actually this is consistent with what they say about their publications, need to be made available as soon as practicable after that publication date. So they really want it to be immediately shared as soon as possible. Department of Education, this language is also consistent with their publication availability expectations, but the underlying data needs to be made available within 30 days of that publication date. In terms of sharing other data that might not be associated with the publications, there is kind of a wide range of language that's being used on when that should be made accessible. So for example, AHRQ and NIH talk about making that data accessible as soon as possible, but also by the end of the award. And NASA's SMD, Science Mission Directorate, also talks about making any other data available by the end of the award. CDC and Department of Education say it needs to be made available in a timely manner. I have not found a definition for what that means exactly, but that's the language being used. But Department of Education also talks about the other data needing to be made available at the completion of the final study or 5 years after the award is closed, whichever comes first. For FDA, the policy in my reading really focuses on making the data underlying publications freely available. So I've reached out to FDA to try to get some clarification about what the expectations are for sharing the other data, but haven't heard back quite yet. Of course, there's also the element and expectations around data management and sharing plans or data management plans. So these are required for all new awards or grants. Most agencies are asking that those be submitted uh, with the application. So that is a requirement for certain agencies. For FDA, it's saying that it's encouraged, but I think that'll be left up to specific solicitations. Some agencies also talk about updating data management and sharing plans. CDC's policy talks about, reviewing annually, and then EPA and NIH talk about having kind of policies or procedures to be able to update the data management sharing plan. I personally think that's very helpful. If your data management sharing plan is written with the application, I think, it would be easy to understand if that needed to change through the course of the research. So I think it's, really helpful that agencies are starting to address this. Agencies do often provide guidance around the elements that should be discussed in a data management and sharing plan. Unfortunately, it is not consistent across all agencies. So some talk about making sure to include descriptions around the type of data, talk about data access, preservation, archiving, and then oversight and team responsibilities. Those are kind of the most common across the agencies. There is, some agencies talk about timelines for data sharing, particularly for data outside of supporting publications. Some say that data management sharing plans should talk about data that can't be shared and why. Some ask for discussion about standards, reuse considerations, and other tools that might be used, software code, things like that. For EPA, I have not found any new suggested elements for their updated policy. So if anyone has come across that, would really love to see that. But as far as my searching so far, I have not kind of found those suggested elements. In terms of cost, the agency policies all talk about data management and preservation costs being allowable, and these should be included in the budget for review during applications. There is some discussion about compliance expectations. So CDC, EPA, and NIH have language around complying with your data management and sharing plans and kind of expectations around making data public as consideration in future award decisions. And there are some agencies that make your plans part of the award terms, and so you're expected to follow what's in the award term. And so by making your plan a part of that, there are those kind of expectations. For data repositories, all of the agency policies talk about using, established data repositories. I don't think I saw any that say like you have to always put your data in this specific agency repository. There are, of course, some agencies that do host data repositories, and I imagine there will be specific or are specific solicitations that say, this data coming out of this solicitation needs to be in this repository. But kind of generally across the board, there doesn't seem to be mostly kind of one single repository where all data that has been funded by that agency needs to go. And then there are also agencies that talk about using data that meet kind of the FAIR standards and the desirable characteristics coming from the National Science and Technology Council. So before I hand it over to Dave, I did just want to kind of briefly mention what is going on with the other agencies. So, the memo says that agencies should have their policies in effect by the end of this calendar year. So that's our expectation to see the rest of the policies going to effect by that date. There are some agencies that do have policies already released, but their effective date has not come up yet. So I did see a question in the Q&A about, why we haven't talked about the Department of Energy requirements. And this webinar is just focused on those agencies that have policies currently in effect. But hopefully we will plan to do more in this series that can address other agency policies. But Department of Energy is one of the agencies whose data policies is coming into effect October 1st. So DOE's publications policy is already in effect, but their updated data management and sharing policy will go into effect October 1st, as well as IMLS and NEH. And then coming up December 31st, the Administration for Community Living, Administration for Children and Families, Census, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission all have policies that are released that say that the policies will go into effect on December 1st. I know we understandably regularly get questions about NSF. We expect that the policy will be part of the updates to the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, or the PAPG, and that will implement the requirements that were included in the Public Access Plan. We had been hearing that that may come out in September. That was already delayed from something that had been we'd heard about earlier. I'm hearing that that may come still later than September. So unfortunately, don't have kind of anything concrete on when NSF might release the updated PAPG. I will say typically when the PAPG is released, it doesn't immediately go into effect. Typically there is some time between release and the effective date. So I don't have any indication that this would be any different, but unfortunately we're still just in kind of a wait and see with NSF. I have heard that NOAA may be releasing their policy soon, and that would go into effect immediately as soon as it is released. With that, I'll hand it over to Dave.
Thanks. I was telling Carly at the beginning that I was really glad to do this webinar, in particular because, well, one, she has a lot to say, but also that's very interesting, but also that there's a whole lot less controversy around some of the legal issues when it comes to the data sharing policies. But there are some legal issues that are worth paying attention to within these policies, and so I wanted to highlight a few of them. One is what they say about data licensing. There are many repository managers and others who are managing research data have kind of come up with some best practices around sharing of data. And a lot of institutional repositories have gravitated towards one license or another. CC0 has become a kind of standard for lots of research data. And so when you look across these policies, one of the questions that arises is, do I have to license my data under particular terms? And so far, there are no hard and fast requirements around licensing. Some of the policies say that the data should have a license. For instance, NASA points this out. And actually, NASA goes a step further and says that if it's permissible under the rights that you have to the data, it recommends that you use a CC0 license. Others, HRQ says this should be addressed in the data management sharing plan. And the CDC just kind of states like a fact essentially that like the awardee retains rights, which is true, and it's not exactly addressing like, yes, but what about how other people can use this data? But that's the extent to which these plans these plans address licensing. So it leaves folks actually with quite a lot of flexibility, I think, um, to make some determinations based on the particular research data that they're working with. Um, about kind of what is the most appropriate licensing for resharing. There are some things, for instance, if you read the NASA plan, it addresses in some separate provisions software. And particularly like, there are some different licensing considerations for software. I realize this is not giving you like okay, I can check the box and go off and do this kind of thing here. But what it does do is leave open quite a bit of flexibility to make some reasonable choices about what licenses should or should not apply. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Um, so how should researchers think about data copyright in terms of compliance? Well, I think, as you just saw, there's not a whole lot of directive in terms of the licensing. Um, so I think that that actually places a lot of, or gives a lot of opportunity for folks who are working with researchers to kind of explain some of the options to them, and some of the pros and cons. I think one of the kind of fundamental things here that's important to remember is that actually lots of the data that is going to be shared under these policies is not copyright protected to begin with. Um, and I think sometimes when you read these policies or when you read other guidance, you kind of jump to the conclusion that like, yes, I should be applying some sort of license, but that's not necessarily true. And in fact, one of the reasons why a CC0 license, and I slipped up, I called it a license. CC0 is actually a waiver of rights. Um, and what it does is it says, to the extent that I have rights in this content, I'm waiving them. And that's an important distinction because actually a lot of data isn't protectable to begin with. So that's not to say all data is unprotectable. Um, but to the extent that the data are just representations of facts, then there's not really anything there to license. And in those cases, I would strongly suggest that something that clarifies the absence of copyright, like attaching a CC0 waiver, is a really appropriate solution to clear up for downstream users how they can interact with that material. Now, one of the big concerns I often hear from people is um, that even with data, they'd really like people to attribute back to the original research project and point out where it came from. Um, and my usual answer to that is that's good, and we should do that, and we should include appropriate metadata so that folks can, attribute back. But including a copyright statement that sort of implies that I might sue you if you don't, probably takes it a step too far, particularly for data that likely isn't protected to begin with. So those are, some of the considerations about thinking about data copyright in terms of compliance, and I think also in terms of conversations with researchers and folks in research offices who are kind of helping to nudge some of this along and set policy for it as well. Um, I think one of the other major considerations here is the type of data that we're talking about. So, the definition of data is pretty expansive, although Carly talked about some of the things that are excluded. But that still could include materials that aren't necessarily like personally identifiable or other content that would be excluded from these plans, but for which, absolute unfettered reuse could be problematic if there weren't some constraints placed around it. Um, I'd like to go to the next slide too, because there's another interesting issue that I've seen come up, particularly with folks who are doing research using creative works, which increasingly I'm working with a lot of people who are engaged in like text data mining research, AI research, and of course, a lot of that interacts with existing copyrighted materials. Um, And so it raises the question, what if my data set is a bunch of websites that I scraped from the internet, or, 1,000 books that I digitized, or um, a large collection of images. And all of those things have copyright, presumably, they have copyright rights in the works that are held by third parties. And so, how do we navigate those materials and trying to make them as widely available as we can pursuant to these policies? One thing I really like about the way that the agencies have approached data sharing is it seems to be a very flexible approach where, you're writing a plan, and within, the framework that you've provided, but there's a certain amount of like reasoning that you can do in there. And the agencies have left quite a bit of room for exclusion of data. So, for instance, and I think lots of you are aware of this, it's come up over the years, things like data that can be excluded because it discloses patentable inventions, right? So that's often kind of a big category of data that has limited release. Or, for instance, data that has national security implications or export control restrictions. So all of the policies acknowledge those kind of ordinary restrictions on data. What's interesting is very few of them directly address the challenge of openly sharing data that may contain third-party copyrighted materials. I think reading through them that there's a pathway to not having to openly share all of those materials. So, for instance, in the NASA policy, it just says that excluded data may include materials that are protected by intellectual property, just kind of a big, broad thing. So that's one version of an exclusion. And if you read in some of the others, they have similar kind of carve outs that allow for basically allowing you to not share data when doing so would be illegal for you. And one instance of that would be sharing data in a way that would contribute to copyright infringement. Um, so I see there are a couple of questions in the, or not questions, but guess a few comments in the chat about the interaction with licensing and sharing and AI. Um, and that's a pretty interesting area because I do know that there has been some thought put into like how should federally funded research and research data be made available for AI training or not. And AI is one of those things where there are strong opinions on a lot of sides of it, but I think that a lot of the policy that has been rolled into place here and the thinking behind it is motivated by the idea that the fewer restrictions we impose on data, the more research that can happen. And so, of course, there's the commercial AI sector, and I'm kind of like cordoning that off for a moment. But I think the intent of these policies is to really accelerate research and allow for reproducibility and allow for scrutiny of existing research. And so it would make sense then that we'd like to see some of this data be used by researchers at institutions who are, using it with AI technology as well, which is increasingly the case. Um, all right, so I think that may be it for my slides. Carly, I can hand this back to you, although I think I know the answer, but go ahead.
Well, why don't you start and then I can keep.
Sure. So all of the policies have requirements about what kinds of characteristics the repository must have. Fair, compliant repositories in particular. You'll see that term in basically all of these policies, I think, if not most of them. I'll just hedge a little bit. But that's the main requirement. My understanding is as long as the repository is compliant, then that's an adequate pathway for sharing, which is pretty different. I want to mention pretty different from what's happening in the publication space, which is where the agencies are specifying a particular repository for the most part and saying this is where all of the articles must live. So Carly, you can correct me if I messed up
No,
any.
I think that's exactly right. And I will say also most of the policies kind of talk about repositories like should meet the characteristics in fair versus a must, I think. So, right, I think they're trying to leave some flexibility. And I think there was some discussion maybe around institutional repositories too. And, I think trying to leave some flexibility there so that, institutional repositories, if they don't quite meet kind of all of those desirable characteristics yet, if they're kind of moving towards that, there's some flexibility there. I'll try to kind of run through some of the other FAQs briefly so we have some time for the other questions that we've received. But one of the questions we received is around, if agencies expect more data management planning than what is included in the data management and sharing plans. And I will say, sometimes these are expected to be brief documents. Some agencies do have page links. And so I would imagine that you might not be able to kind of put everything that you're thinking about around data management into that plan. And these are plans. And so they might evolve along the way and think that makes a lot of sense. And so at this point, agencies kind of provide those suggested elements as a way to more kind of widely think about data management considerations, and then tailor that specifically to the type of research that you're proposing to do. And then also agencies and funding program offices might have some additional requirements. There might be repositories specified, or there might be more specifics around the expectations of data preservation. And so, that might kind of factor into the quote, more extensive data management. But really, I think this process is intended to get folks thinking about how they will manage their data early in the process. So it's not kind of an afterthought, long down the line after the data has been collected. And then it's just that much more difficult to make it publicly available and to kind of meet those requirements. Also, question about, are these plans peer reviewed? And this really depends on the agency's process and kind of when the plans are collected and evaluated. But my read is that the plans are always reviewed. It's just that they might be reviewed by agency staff versus being part of the peer review process. And I know, for example, in the NIH policy, they did receive comments about, could this be peer reviewed versus reviewed by agency staff? And NIH did address that kind of in the responses to their policy. So HRQ, EPA, and NIH specifically say that these plans are evaluated by program staff. CDC says it can kind of happen either way, depending on that process that they're using for that specific solicitation. I could not find any specifics from Department of Education or NASA SMD about kind of who is doing that review. And then I will say, in some of the other agency policies that are not yet in effect, there is discussion about that as them being reviewed during the peer review process. So the takeaway is that they are reviewed, but not every agency kind of has the plans as part of the peer review process. So we touched on this a little bit before, but I think this is a very common question. What data needs to be shared and preserved? And unfortunately, this is very difficult to answer because the answer is it really depends. Most agencies say that not all data needs to be shared and preserved, and the focus is really on data needed to validate and replicate research findings. And so what the agencies are asking is that, the PIs as part of the planning process, make recommendations about what they think is most appropriate for the research that they're going to be conducting. And then there's that review to determine if that's appropriate. I will say, kind of in the previous iteration of this policy, I think there are discussions around the plans, but I haven't seen any, any proposal specifically not funded because of what the plan said. It's more, a discussion about kind of what was appropriate and could be updated if something else was deemed during that review to make more sense. But really, as part of that review, looking at either community standards around that specific area of research, or if it does go through the peer review process to kind of determine what's appropriate. Question about compliance and how will it be monitored? I will say this is much more difficult than monitoring compliance with publications, which is already not easy or straightforward. And so, as a first step, I think where agencies have been is just making sure that you have a plan and then it's reviewed, right? That was the first kind of compliance check. And then, it comes in of making sure you do what you say you're going to do in the plan or update it if it's needed. And I am seeing some discussion in the chat about, are there any instances where the data management and sharing plan do not become a part of the the award terms and conditions? And I will say, in response to the 2013 memo, I know that there were agencies that did not directly put the specific data management and sharing plan as a term. They had kind of more general language. And so that's a really interesting question. I will say I do not know as of yet for those other agencies that didn't specifically say this will become an award term, if they will do that in practice, or if the award term might say something more general, like you need to follow what you said you do in your data management and sharing plan. Right? It might have more general language like that, but that's something that we can dig into a little bit more because I think that's a really good question. But really, it's kind of up to program managers and people managing the awards and closing out the awards to do those kinds of checks. And so I do think that this is a bit of an open question of what compliance looks like and what compliance tracking looks like. Some agencies have said they will be checking compliance, but there's not a whole lot of details about how that happens in practice. Again, we talked a little bit about this already. Does data need to be hosted in a specific like agency hosted repository? So for the most part, that's not at a high level what agency policies say. I do expect that in specific solicitations, it might say, for example, you have to put this genomics data in GenBank, or you need to put this atmospheric data in, one of the DOE funded repositories, things like that. NSF, it funds a lot of repositories. So I wouldn't be surprised if that language is in specific solicitations, but it does seem like there's a lot of flexibility about where the data can be hosted and, recommending repositories that meet FAIR guidelines and the desirable characteristics. We received a question about data management and sharing plan templates. And I will say, traditionally, most agencies have provided the suggested elements versus a specific template, although there were some agencies that did provide templates. But of course, there are tools like DMP tool where they do work with agencies to make sure that that template kind of reflects those suggested elements for the agency. I will say, for the newest policies coming out of these agencies, I have not found any specific templates coming from the agencies, but if that's something that other folks have found, that would be really great to know about and to share. But what I've seen so far is that it's primarily just those suggested elements that you could basically use as a template, but it's not in kind of a more typical template format. So those were all of the questions that we received ahead of time. So I think at this point we could jump into additional questions.